Liberal MP and Parliamentary Secretary Rob Oliphant ripped into his government's policy on the war in Gaza. He did it in a phone call with a constituent, and a recording of that phone call was provided to CBC News. Oliphant criticized his government's decision to suspend funding to a UN aid agency supporting Palestinians.
It drives me crazy. It is opportunistic, it is unfair, and it is maligning the operation of a UN organization that is doing not perfect work. There's no organization that's made of human beings that's perfect. Under has its faults, but it is the best we have.
Opposition parties say the contrast between Oliphant's private comments compared to his public defense of the government's position on the Israel-Hamas war undercuts the Liberals' position.
It's another example of how Justin Trudeau is a two-faced phony on the Middle East, just like everything else.
He should be brave enough to say it publicly. It feels very much to me like a very liberal thing to say one thing publicly and to say a different thing privately.
Create a situation where nobody trusts, nobody listens to what Canada says.
All right, we're going to discuss this with the Power Panel. Shachi Kurl is the president of the Angus Reid Institute. James Moore is a former Conservative cabinet minister. Andrew Thompson is a former Saskatchewan NDP cabinet minister. And Jonathan Kalis is a former Quebec advisor to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Hello, gang. Jonathan, I'd like to start with you. We know there's been a deep split in the Liberal caucus over the conflict between Israel and Hamas. They've held it together, but there is disagreement. What do you make of the Parliamentary Secretary for the Minister of Foreign Affairs saying he's thought about quitting his job over the government's positions on Palestinian support?
Well, I think this is, just another example of that there are deep divisions in the caucus. It's different because it's a parliamentary secretary. So whatever his opinion is, he's supposed to be representing the government, the official line. And so it's all very nice to say we have differences of opinion within our caucus. We have this divide, but it's democracy and it's people sharing their opinions. That doesn't work when you hold a position. It's not a minister, but it's close enough and it's in the specific related file. So, there will be no consequences. I can't imagine there being consequences because the outcry would be too great. But it is a continuation of the pitfalls of the Liberal strategy from the beginning of this conflict to try to be all things to all people. And what's really interesting, it struck me, late this afternoon, I noticed a video going around on Twitter, or X, or whatever it's called, and of Rob Oliphant talking to a Palestinian woman who was asking very sort of, direct questions, upset about the government's policy, where he basically denounces a couple of his caucus colleagues, calling them arrogant for accepting the ICJ sort of case and saying that, no, there's no genocide because it hasn't been proven, and my colleagues who say it's genocide are being arrogant and ridiculous in a very aggressive tone. So he's almost contradicting himself, what he was caught on this conversation that came out today. So, lots of people have different opinions. The government seems to have people saying and representing different opinions. And now you have Rob Oliphant himself demonstrating that he has different opinions.
Right. So on this recording, James, he says rhetorically to himself, do I believe there's genocidal activity on the part of Israel? Probably yes, from what I have seen, is what he said there. I've interviewed Rob Oliphant a bunch of times, and he always seems like a really thoughtful guy, who grapples with difficult issues. But he is in a situation here where he stands in the House of Commons to defend the government's policy on this, and he's saying something completely different now, in these recordings. I mean, how tenable is this for him going forward? How does the government manage this, do you think?
It's not tenable. The clip package that you played at the front end of the segment would perfectly put it well, because everybody was correct. Rob Oliphant was sincere in what he said, and I believe him at his word. Pierre Poilievre was correct that this shows that when Justin Trudeau leaves the world wide open for anybody to be a member of the Liberal Party and hold any views, that you're going to get a multitude of views, which leads Canada's position to nowhere. The NDP are correct that if Rob Oliphant believes this, then he should have the courage of his convictions and to say this publicly and to stand by his views. He's a thoughtful person, and he should say what he says. I assume that's why he ran for office. And the Bloc Québécois are correct that all of this leads to Canada having no position that is of any value in the world because we're all over the road when it comes to Prime Minister Trudeau. Prime Minister Trudeau should also expect more of this, by the way, not just sort of leaked tapes, and which I'm uncomfortable with, because the idea of having a private meeting and it gets recorded and people leak it and in a gotcha moment, that's not how these things should be done. It only leads to people taking fewer meetings and being less transparent on what their views are. That aside, Justin Trudeau should probably expect more of this, not just of leaked conversations, but actually when you're 19 points down in the polls across the country, 20 points behind Pierre Poilievre in who's the best prime minister, 3-1 net negatives. People in your caucus and parliamentary secretaries who are never going to become cabinet ministers, backbenchers who see the end of their political career more in front of them and more of it in the rearview mirror than in front of it. These people are all going to start speaking out and taking choice positions that are closer to their heart than they are to their political self-interest. And so I think because Justin Trudeau has such a aimless approach on the question of the Middle East, he's going to have more conflicts in front of him because he's handling it, I think, so poorly and so aimlessly in terms of where his moral compass is.
Yeah, Andrew, on the point of like the leaked recording, I mean, this was something, Evan and I talked about, and he said he sort of struggled with it, because of the nature of the issues that James outlined, but it does show a contradiction between the public position and the private position, and that's the news value in it. And people may disagree, honestly, and we understand that, but I mean, what do you make of where this leaves things right now for Rob Oliphant and the Liberals?
Well, I think we should be clear that this shows a difference between where Rob Oliphant is and where the government is. I think he's been consistent probably in his position inside and out of caucus. I mean, a couple of things I would just offer is, politicians learn in Politician School 101, never say anything privately that you wouldn't be prepared to defend publicly. And so, this assumption that somehow your private conversations, especially with activist stakeholders and constituents, is not somehow going to be, read out in public, is a bad assumption. Second piece, though, and I think this is where it's a bigger concern for the Liberals, is not that there's a diversity of opinion within the Liberal Party. I suspect there's a diversity of opinion within each of the parties on this issue. The problem is that there's an old adage in politics that says, you hang together or you hang separately. And what they've decided in this case is they'd rather each hang separately than hang together as a caucus to try to defend the position. There was no effort from what we could see and what I've seen on this to defend the government's position, to understand where the government was coming from. It is very much now, it appears, every MP for themselves. And that's a desperate situation for a caucus to find itself in a governing party. It projects to the public that they cannot keep their own house in order, and as such calls into question whether they can effectively govern. And secondly, I think it calls into question just whether or not this is a party that does have a cohesive governance structure internally to actually make decisions and to move forward.
Shachi, how do you see this one?
Well, a couple things. First of all, in the clip package, the one clip or the one bit that wasn't included were the comments from Pierre Poilievre also talking about and calling on Justin Trudeau not to play the politics of division and to try and play the politics of unity. I would just sort of push back on that a little bit and say both parties have indulged in, exacerbated, and really intensified not only identity politics, but the politics of division in the political Canadian landscape today. So, there's a little bit of a baloney factor there, but let's bring it back to Justin Trudeau. Let's bring it back to Rob Oliphant. I don't know necessarily that Mr. Oliphant's position now as a parliamentary secretary is tenable, given that, there is supposed to be something called cabinet unity, and that should indeed include the next level down of parliamentary secretaries. That said, this is an issue when we talk about the utility of politics and the Liberals being down 20 points in the polls. This is a situation, too, where the Liberal Party is divided under its own base. It's not just the caucus, it's the base. On the issue of continuing to fund UNRWA, our polling from I think it was earlier this week, continues to show that you've got a tilt where just about half of Liberal Party voters say that that should continue, although just under half say no, it should be suspended. It's a far harder road politically for the Liberals to walk than any other party. The Conservatives and the Conservative base are almost entirely in lockstep and aligned on a lot of these issues, including suspending funding. The vast majority of NDP voters say that it should continue. It's not just a matter of caucus management. It's also a matter, I think, of the party politically at this stage, trying to basically save its own diverse voting diasporas. It's got a Muslim bloc of voters that it cannot afford to alienate. It's got long-time established, committed fundraising Jewish voters that it cannot afford to alienate. Does any of this make for serious or coherent foreign policy? No. However, this isn't going to be a voting issue in terms of taking, what I mean by that is taking a stand one way or the other only serves to punish the Liberals politically. So this, let's talk about it, let's have differing and diverse views. And by the way, Canadians do have profoundly diverse and complicated views on this issue. The polling is very clear on that too. So if anything, the Liberal stance on this, while to the world may look like gobbledygook, and indeed Canadians do see it that way, internally it is holding up a mirror back to Canadian society that really reflects how much people are wrestling with these issues.
So Jono, on that, right, you can see the division in big cities and with the protests and the accusations back and forth, right, and the hurt and the pain on it. How do they manage this better as a government when you have the Parlsec to the minister disagreeing with the positions articulated by the minister and by the prime minister, and as you sort of suggested in your answer, satisfying nobody with this, the worst spot to be in politics, sort of in the middle of an almost binary issue? Oh, I can't hear Jono there, gang.
Well, maybe I can answer that.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. We'll get your next, James. Just go ahead, Jonathan.
I'll try. Listen, when you're in the middle, there are definite advantages. Obviously you can attract on a plethora of issues that are not as emotionally divisive. You could probably attract more voters, and that's why you have generally, historically, a larger base or potential pool of voters for the Liberals. But when you have an emotionally charged issue like this, you've seen major Muslim groups announce that that's it. They even canceled a meeting with the Prime Minister an hour or two before. You've had major Jewish groups come out very angry about different statements over the last 4 months. So, in terms of the voters, are they represented by these groups? To an extent, yes. And I think that the Liberals may have lost some of these voters. The question is, can they keep the majority of their voters that are still hanging around solidly there by having a position that is, sorry, Shachi, I'm going to try to use the word gobbledygook. I don't know if I got it.
You did it.
Basically, close enough. By doing that, the lack of taking a leadership stance, taking a stance that may offend some people, but at least you have a strong position. The people who are indifferent to this subject may at least respect that you've taken a strong stance. And by taking no stance, it's not only the people who are mostly emotionally connected to this, but I think everybody starts to feel annoyed, alienated, because they don't even know what it stands for.
Sorry, James, your turn now. You wanted to try to answer it.
No, what was just said, he got to exactly the right point there at the end, right? Which was that the problem, I think, with all of this in the calculus is that, frankly, it's too much politics. This calculus of this cohort, that cohort, this group, this map, what about Montreal, what about Toronto, what about this group and that group? When a government is on its heels and it's way down in the polls and you start doing, the overlays of the maps and the calculus and the demographic impact of your positions, this is where you start losing everybody, because everybody thinks everything is based on a political map rather than on a matter of the heart and the soul. And I think a lot of Canadians Canadians have a lot of views on this, and yes, they can be intense at times, but I think Canadians respect governments that have clarity of their moral position and their views, and they articulate it concisely and consistently. That matters more than the games that are being played. What I was going to jump in on, though, was the first part of your question, David, which was, it's untenable for a minister to have a parliamentary. I was a minister of multiple portfolios, had lots of different parliamentary secretaries. If I was the minister of when I was minister of official languages, if my parliamentary secretary was saying, the Official Languages Act is out of date and we should totally revamp it because it's just completely out of step with the diversity of Canada. If I'm the Minister of Official Languages, I think I have a problem with that person being my parliamentary secretary, and I need to have a conversation with the Prime Minister. So Minister Joly and Mr. Oliphant need to have a coming to Jesus moment of clarity here about where they're at in terms of their partnership and the leadership of this government's position on foreign affairs and how they express it to the world. This is untenable.
Andrew, is it all politics, do you think, with the Liberals, or are they just genuinely deeply conflicted by this, by being horrified by Hamas, but also looking at a nearly 30,000 person death toll now in Gaza by some estimates, and being also troubled by that? Because we're seeing France, we're seeing the United Kingdom, we're seeing the United States all sort of walking this line, while maybe also being more clear in their support for Israel, I think, in some of the language, but also deeply troubled by what the Netanyahu government is doing here.
Yeah, it's interesting that both the UK, France, the US are all taking not entirely dissimilar positions to what the Prime Minister was laying out today, but they seem to be doing it in a way that looks more coherent. And maybe we're not following the local politics in those countries as closely to understand what the second conversations are. This just seems like it is very chaotic, that it's a mess, that is being made up at the last minute, as opposed to really driving towards something. Now, I do think that the Prime Minister's comments today, where he was outlining the work that he's doing with various world leaders, what they're pushing towards, finally towards, whether it's workable or not, some solutions in the Middle East, that has a sense of coherence to it that we've not otherwise seen to date. And, this is where I think people are really unclear as to, are they speaking to various constituencies based on, what they're trying to curry vote on? Is it deeply held personal views of MPs that are carrying the day? Or is there an actual strategy here in place? And that's I think that's really something where obviously the Prime Minister has lost control of the caucus and lost control of the narrative. Can he get that back or not? I don't know. But right now, I think people really are wondering, just what's going on.
Okay, Shachi, a quick last word to you, and then we got to take a break.
Quickly then, what I'll talk about is just how in some ways it is regrettable that we aren't used to hearing from individual MPs, regardless of party stripe, regardless of issue, enough in terms of their own beliefs and where they stand. So you have these situations where you're saying one thing quietly and one thing out loud. I think that is just my take on it, the result of a decades-long series of really sort of atmosphere within Parliament where backbenchers and MPs are not necessarily free to speak their mind, especially if they have cabinet ambitions. And I think moments like this give us a whoa, like, oh, so-and-so said that. And beyond the context of the way this government is handling the issue or not handling the issue, I think it also sort of speaks to maybe we need to get used to hearing people saying whatever it is they want to say and judging them for those comments so we don't have these flip-flops.